In the final video on pre-production, we're going to talk about how to prototype your game and why you should be prototyping your game. This is often the hardest part of game development for students to understand, but it's incredibly useful, which is why it's such a big part of coursework 1. If you put some effort into prototyping, you can be much more confident that your project is heading in the right direction and will be done on time. A prototype is a kind of extremely limited realization of your game design. As a game, it should probably be playable and should contain the core elements that capture the essence of the design you're trying to build. But it shouldn't be much more than that. It shouldn't look or sound good. It shouldn't contain more than, say, one level. It shouldn't be polished in any way. And it certainly shouldn't show off any of the fancy optional features that you might be planning to embellish your core gameplay with to get those extra marks. So, being honest, you will probably think your prototype is a bit rubbish. And that leads some students to undervalue the prototyping process. Why make a cheap version of your game when you could be working on the actual game? Why go for the cardboard mech when you could be building the real thing? The answer will be obvious once you've finished making your game. If only you had had that one important insight earlier in development, you could have avoided all those mistakes that you made. Having a working model of your game early on is a bit like gazing into a crystal ball to tell the future. It allows you to learn about your game and learn what the mistakes might be before you even enter production, and so you can avoid those costly mistakes. Now, unfortunately, prototyping doesn't mean that you won't make any mistakes, but done well, it will help you learn enough about your game to avoid making really big ones. So your prototype needs to have a focus. It's going to contain what you might call sketches of particular mechanics or features which you think are central to the experience of this game, things that without them you don't have the game that you're trying to build. Other aspects of the game can be very kind of minimal or rough versions, or just completely absent. So things like artwork or audio you don't even have to include, and certainly features which don't actually contribute to that core gameplay can just be left out of the prototype entirely. In fact, all of that optional stuff should absolutely be left out of the prototype, because the more you include in your prototype, the more it distracts from the actual purpose here, which is to figure out what's going on with the core of your design. To hammer this point home, prototyping is really an essential part of game development. So you're confronting a problem here that you don't really know whether your game's going to be fun, whether it's going to feel right, or whether some feature that you intend to implement, which you've never implemented before, is going to work the way you think it's going to work. So by putting those kinds of things into a prototype, the gameplay you hope is fun and feels good, or that particular feature which you're not quite sure about, by putting those things into a prototype, you can test them out alone without committing any other resources to developing full versions of these in a game. So if you can find out the right way to do something, or whether something works or doesn't work, with that cheap version, then it stops you wasting time implementing things which may not work in the end. And that if you had done full versions of, you would have ended up re-implementing anyway. So, as I said, some game dev students don't like prototyping and avoid it because they see it as some kind of side activity which isn't the real business of coding the actual game. And generalizing, unfortunately, those students do tend to make bad games, which may be technically complete, but don't really have the right features or features working in the way they're intended. And of course, if you make a bad game, that makes me sad. So we're going to look at some of the kinds of prototyping that you could do in this module, but it's just worth reflecting that prototyping takes place in the games industry in all sorts of ways. There are obviously lots of different kinds of games being made, different kinds of games company, and there's lots of different forms of prototyping. Here's one nice quote from the founder of Ninja Theory, talking about prototyping on Hellblade: Senua's Sacrifice. So he's saying what they wanted to build in a game like Hellblade is very unknown and risky. It's the prototype phase where they encourage risk-taking and try out ideas that may or may not work. They do this for every phase of the game, as there's always risky new stuff in design or art or production to try out before betting the farm on it. So the kind of big takeaway there is this idea of unknown and risky. If you've got something that's going into your game that you don't really understand, you don't know really how it's going to work, or perhaps you have a good idea how it's going to work, but it could go wrong, it's a big risk. These are the things which you need to be putting into your prototype. Prototypes come in many forms. One of the cheapest and most valuable is paper prototyping. It's cheap, obviously, because paper is cheap and disposable. So if you get your prototyping wrong, you can throw away that bit of paper and start again. It's surprisingly valuable because it can be done very early in the development process, before you ever need to write a line of code, and it can also be revised very quickly. So if your design changes, it's easy to modify that bit of paper, add a new element to your game just by sketching something out and cutting it out. In fact, whilst you're actually playtesting a paper prototype, you can modify it on the fly, which is super valuable. The hard part in paper prototyping is figuring out how you can usefully realize some critical part of your game in paper. It can work very well for some genres, so anything that's turn-based, that is basically a digital board game, probably will translate quite well and in quite the entire game design to paper versions. But even real-time games like first-person shooters, you can make some kind of turn-based board game-like version in order to test out specific things like balancing a weapon system or exploring the impact of different NPC behaviors. The key hit here is realizing that only part of the game needs to be made in paper, so you can study that particular part, and you're not trying to recreate the whole experience in some paper version. Here's a paper prototype of an iPad game called Bad Piggies, which was a sequel to Angry Birds. So you can see that they're using a kind of paper puppet show approach to show you how you're going to interact with the various game menus. So first of all, starting the game, seeing the level, and then going through this process of configuring a little cart which the pig's going to use to ride through the level. Yep, there's some interaction where they've obviously not built the cart and the pigs died. So now they assemble a better looking cart and select that. Yep, and you can see that crucial interaction where they press the booster, let them jump over the pit. Here's a slightly fancier paper prototype showing this kind of squad-based tactics game when you're selecting these group of characters to go into this level and battle with these monsters. You can see that they're using transparent overlays in order to simulate the process of selecting particular items on the screen and things like area of effect. Here I think this is blue overlays indicating where you can move your character. Now this is much more advanced than I'd expect any of the students on this module to be doing, because it's obviously a huge amount of time to develop a paper prototype as fancy as this. Honestly, you've got better things to get on with your time. So there's a lesson here: don't spend too much time working on any paper prototypes you build. They can be incredibly useful, but you don't want to be wasting your time making them look polished. So what's paper prototyping good for? Well, it's good for working out what the basic elements are going to be in your game, the kind of verbs and nouns we talked about in an earlier video. Working out what they are and how they interact with each other. It's very good for working out game spaces, what kinds of level design you want to be adopting, how you move through those levels and progress through other objectives. It's good for prototyping simple systems, which you can easily simulate by moving bits of paper around. Things like GUI elements are really easy to do in paper, so you can just kind of slide the element on, let a player interact with it, and then react accordingly. Surprisingly, AI behavior is quite easy to prototype in paper. You don't actually realize the AI code itself, but what you do is you get a member of your team to basically control some bit of paper and follow some sort of script about how they should be behaving. So it's a bit like a puppet show. They're controlling this agent, but you can get good insights into how various approaches to that agent behavior are going to interact with the player. And another thing that paper prototypes are quite good at is testing the readability of your game. So by presenting some kind of paper analog of your game to the player, if they can understand this situation and understand what's important and what they should be doing, then hopefully that's going to translate into the digital version as well. And in some cases, depending on the game, it's also going to hopefully replicate some of the fun of the final experience, but not necessarily. It depends on whether the missing elements from the paper prototype are actually crucial to that fun. So we're not requiring you to make a paper prototype in this module, so I guess most of you probably won't do that, but it's an extremely valuable way of understanding what you're making, and my advice is to make one anyway, because it will save you time. Spend a little time spent in paper is going to save you many, many hours spent sweating over code. On this module, we are asking you to build a digital prototype, so let's take a look at some of those. Prototyping your game in code doesn't necessarily mean implementing a simpler, cut-down version of it. Let's take a look at this example, World of Goo, which was released in 2008. So on the left-hand side, you can see what the game looks like. It's all about these cute little black balls which kind of wibble about and jump up and down, and you have to get from one place in the level to another place in the level. In order to do that, what you can do is assemble these into kind of these sticky, wobbly structures which kind of wave around in interesting ways. And you can build the structures out of the little balls and get the little balls to move across the structures to get to where they need to be. So what's the essential kind of part of this game design? It's not how the game looks, it's not like kind of cartoonish graphics, it's not the kind of cute little ball characters, although they're absolutely an essential part of the game. But they're not particularly risky, right? You know you can probably make a little black cute ball character jump up and down. It's not necessarily the layout of the levels, although they're important, and you will need to do lots of sketches to work out the different kinds of puzzles which the player is going to have to overcome. The kind of essence of this game is you are building these structures out of these little balls, kind of node and line structures. And you've got to be able to build them in interesting ways so that they kind of form interesting shapes that you can do interesting things with in the level. So the first technical prototype, the first digital prototype rather, is shown on the right-hand side there. So when the developers first had the idea for the game, the first thing they did was build this digital prototype. It looks terrible. It has absolutely none of the personality and character. It has none of the gameplay even. There's no objectives. All you're doing is assembling, in this case, very, very large structures out of these little balls which kind of connect together in lines. It's basically about the kind of the physics simulation of these structures and whether they interact in interesting ways. So for the developer, the riskiest part of their design was the idea that you would be able to construct these structures at all and how those structures will actually behave. It's a complex thing to understand. Certainly you can write that idea down, but you don't really know how it's going to work when it comes to the final game. And you certainly can't use paper to prototype that kind of thing. So what they did was write this very simple technical prototype, which just prototyped that one particular aspect of the game that they thought was risky. If this doesn't work, none of the rest of the game works. The rest of the game is a lot less risky, so the prototype focuses on that one particular thing. Now, relatively speaking, digital prototypes can take more time because obviously you have to write code, but it doesn't have to be expensive. The idea is still that you have a cheap working model that provides some insight about your game, and it should be focused on some aspect of the game that you really need to study, that you really want to learn more about. And it can be relatively cheap to just do that simple prototype which answers that question, gives you the confidence to move on with game development. So here's an example of another digital prototype which was developed for a game that was released on PS4 about 10 years ago. Quite a well-known game, and the game centers around the relationship between two characters. One that's going to be controlled by the player, another that's going to be played by somebody playing in another location. So what this prototype is trying to answer is, how are those two characters going to interact? What kind of interaction is going to kind of bind them together? You can see they've got this kind of very extremely simple level, and they're testing out how the two characters might help each other navigate that level. So for this game, that was actually just the first in a series of digital prototypes which the developers built. So here's the next iteration in that series. So they've completely changed how the game looks in terms of what perspective we've got on the action. But what it's kept is a central idea which they're still trying to work out the mechanics of and how it should feel. The idea of these two characters which are traveling together. You can see they're now navigating a completely different kind of environment, but there's this kind of nice effects we can see. We can see they're leaving these trails, so we can see where the characters have been, and there seems to be one character who's in the lead who's kind of growing and shrinking in interesting ways. Here's another digital prototype in the same series leading towards the development of the same game. At this point you might start to recognize what the game is, if you haven't guessed already. So this prototype is addressing a very different question. It's not looking at the interaction of those two characters. What it's doing is testing out what the environment might look like. So we can kind of see how the levels are going to be laid out and get some idea of the kind of the atmosphere. So in this prototype, again, another digital prototype, not quite the final game. You can probably see, if you know the game, which is Journey by that game company, you can recognize that most of the elements are already here. So we've got a much more detailed environment, still not finished, but it evokes a lot of what the final game is going to look like. And you've got the two characters now actually interacting in that environment. So one of them is controlled by the player, the other is somebody else playing that game elsewhere. As you can see, digital prototypes are incredibly versatile. You can do anything in a digital prototype that you might do in your final game, but typically they're focusing on one important aspect of the game. Perhaps later in development you might bring together lots of different elements into a more polished looking prototype in order to, say, do some more detailed play testing. But compared to paper prototypes, they're obviously a lot more expensive, so you have to put a lot of thought into what you're really prototyping and why you're building this particular digital prototyping. You can do a lot of things in digital prototypes that you just can't do in paper prototypes. For example, there are lots of mechanics in games which are not easily modelled in paper because they just too complex. You can prototype aesthetic elements, so how things look or sound if they are particularly crucial to how your game is going to work. You can say prototype a new interface solution if it's something that you've never attempted before. And you can explore things like audio and visual feedback, which responds in real time, and see how satisfying that is, how that contributes to the kind of use of the game. Prototypes can also focus on novel technological aspects. Perhaps you're trying a new kinds of physics system which you've never worked with before, or if it's in fact completely novel, or some AI solution which again needs to be prototyped in detail. That can be done using digital prototype. And that kind of feel, that kind of cues about how the controls actually respond to the player and how that really feels kind of intuitive to them, that kind of stuff can only be captured in digital prototype. So what are the expectations for the prototype in the first coursework? So I think I've covered most of the main points so far in this video, but let's kind of recap. What's the essence of prototyping? So the idea is make it simple, include only the core elements of your design. You have to work out in the prototype whether they work together, whether they make sense together, and whether that's an engaging experience. So it's that core set of elements that you're testing out in your prototype. You might have some uncertainty about them, things you're not entirely sure about how they're going to work, or whether you should be doing them at all. And it's those uncertain areas of your design which your prototype should zero in on. Whether that's, does this particular game mechanic work? Does the player understand this particular game mechanic? Or will this novel technical solution, which I've decided to include in my game, will that actually work at all? Whatever the uncertainty is, that's where you should be focusing. So it's important to realize that a prototype is not just half a game or a quarter of a game. You don't just think about all the work that you've got to do to finish the entire project and just take some chunk of that, make that the prototype. No, you have to focus in on what are the most urgent questions about your design and make those the focus of the prototype. You haven't got time to prototype everything. That would indeed defeat the purpose of the prototype entirely, so you have to really prioritize. Generally, I'd say don't include any art or audio assets unless they're absolutely essential. So, for example, if you're doing a horror game, then there might be aspects of the lighting or the atmosphere that you really need to focus on in your prototype, but they certainly shouldn't be complete. They should just be evoking the final atmosphere of the game without realizing it. And it's important not to spend time on those kind of unnecessary elements because you won't get credit for them in the prototype mark. If we see things we think are unnecessary and haven't met what our definition of a prototype is, then you won't be getting credit for them. So it's important to be strict with yourself. Really understand what should go in and what should go out. Discuss it as a group. And be focused. Don't leave out core elements. If it's something which is integral to your game and we don't see it in the prototype, then we're going to see that it's missing and not like that. In some previous years, some people have confused the idea of simplicity and core elements with they couldn't be bothered. So they thought, well, we'll implement this thing and this thing and then be in a game, and yeah, we can't be bothered to implement that, so we'll just hand it in. That's not going to get you a good mark. If it's part of the core gameplay, then it should be realized in a simple form in the prototype. So hopefully the examples I've shown you have kind of given you some ideas about how you focus in on what's important and how you produce that kind of working model of your game. But of course, we're here to help. So if you're unsure about exactly what you should be including in or out of your prototype, then by all means get a second opinion. Come and talk to Diego or myself or to the demonstrators. And of course, you should be developing your prototype over several versions, over several iterations, and getting feedback on a regular basis from us and from other people on the module. I want to end on another quote from linear theories, Tamim and Theonodius. So this is a bit of a longer quote, but I think it's quite revealing of a really important issue in prototyping. So, as I've hopefully communicated in this lecture, prototyping is all about taking the risks that you don't really want to take in the final production of the game, experimenting a little bit, and coming up with solutions to problems. It's also about answering things which you're not sure about. So, Tamim makes an important point in this quote where he says that many team members will try and create work that they think is usable in the final game. So if you're creating the prototype, then, well, if you're implementing this bit of code, of course, it's going to be something that you might want to put into the final game as well, right? You're killing two birds with one stone. You're saving yourself work. Well, this is a trap. So what Tamim says is that it shifts focus away from being mercenary about testing and prototyping solutions and focus instead on creating shippable content. So those two ideas are kind of opposed to each other. Right? If you're really experimenting and trying things out, then you're not producing work which is hopefully going to go into the final game. Right? So what this does is kind of avoids the purpose of prototyping and kind of leaves it a little bit ineffectual, leaves it questions unanswered, and therefore doesn't give you the value that you hopefully get out of the prototype. So that's not to say that if something goes in the prototype, it can't be reused in the final game. Of course it can. The point is, don't build the prototype thinking about the final game, thinking about this being some bit of work you've done and you've ticked it off for submission. That's not the case. Make it because you want to make the prototype and focus on that. So I particularly like the end of this quote, which is, if you hear that phrase being used, be afraid. In my experience, when you try and kill two birds with one stone, the stone will miss its mark, and the two birds will come to peck your eyes out in bloody revenge. So that's the end of the lecture on prototyping. Thanks very much for listening.